his lectures as one of the great authors. He said, whenever I'm introduced as one of the great authors, it makes me nervous because great authors have a sad habit of dying off. And he said Chaucer is dead, Milton is dead, Shakespeare is dead, and I'm not feeling very well myself. That's the only comparison I'm going to make. Thank God I'm still alive. Look at that picture up there. Thank you, Michelle, for making me look 20 years younger than I am. Those of you who know me obviously know what I look like and roughly how old I am. But when Michelle asked me to send her a picture, I said, oh, just Google my name on, just Google my name, you'll find a picture. This is what you came up with. So, for those of you who expected a younger version, I apologize for the gap between your expectation and the reality. So, on with the program. I'm happy to be with you tonight for a couple of reasons. One, it gives me an opportunity to relive my early days at the Holland Sentinel. And two, it gives me an opportunity to pay homage not only to Sarah Leach, which we'll do later tonight, but also to my late friend and mentor, Randy Vanderwater. Randy was the Sentinel sports editor when I worked there, and he was my first boss. We're talking 1959. I was a senior co-op student at Holland High School and worked 4 hours, 8 to 12 every morning for class credit. Plus I got paid $1 an hour, which by the end of the week was enough for a cheap date. This was right after Sputnik. It was when Eisenhower was president. It was when the civil rights movement was just getting underway. And when Jim Cott, a kid from Zealand, had just got called up to the big leagues. The Sentinel was an evening paper then. It had a circulation of 20,000, and it went to virtually every household in Holland. People read newspapers more in those days. And they not only knew what their neighbors were up to, but also their elected officials. It was the golden age of print journalism. I was happy to be in on a small part of that, first here in Holland and later in Chicago, until the digital revolution came along and changed everything, not always for the better. Michelle asked me to speak about my own career in journalism and my book, Dateline World, that came out a few months ago. So that's what I'm going to focus on. And I want to say a few words about Randy Vanderwater. And if we have time, I'll read an excerpt or two from my book. I put together a PowerPoint, mainly to keep me on track, but also to spice up my story a bit, since it's really pretty ordinary. There are others in this room, John Tommy, for example. I saw him come in with Marilyn, whose stories are a lot more interesting than mine. But I figured some pictures will help, and maybe an embellishment here and there. But mainly I'll try to stick to the truth. So, how do we do this? Here's the title of my talk, Dateline World, Chronicles of a Wasted Freelance. It's not original. I actually stole it in part from a book I read about 40 years ago, just to aim this in the right direction. Chronicles of Wasted Time by Malcolm Muggeridge, an English journalist and satirist. He was the editor of Punch magazine for many years. This is autobiography. In it, he talks about Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist, and the legend of the green stick. Tolstoy believed the green stick was buried near his home that carried the secret of everlasting happiness. He spent most of his life in a quest for the green stick, and I'll come back to that later. For clarity's sake, I'm splitting this talk into 3 parts. I come by this honestly because my dad, who was a minister, always had 3 points in his sermons. That carried over into my own work, including Dateline World, parts 1, 2, and 3, places, people, and viewpoints. So here we have part 1, Growing Pains, Hingham to Holland, 1951 to 1963. Hingham refers to Hingham, Wisconsin, where I spent 4 years in my early childhood. In 1951, my dad accepted a call to Hingham Reformed Church. The sketch is from a commemorative plate my wife found in the pantry. I suppose you could say Hingham was where I started my journalism career. And I'll say something about that in a minute. Hingham had a population of about 200, not including pigs, chickens, roosters, stray dogs, etc. The church held more people than the town. One of my early memories is going up into the steeple with a buddy of mine and throwing snowballs down at cars. There wasn't much else to do for entertainment. And the drivers couldn't figure out where in the world these snowballs were coming from. It was great fun until the church custodian caught us in the act and banned us from the belfry, so to speak. Even my dad wouldn't pardon us. Which makes me wonder what Joe Biden will do about Hunter, but that's all. Hingham is where I also got introduced to politics. Remember this guy? Alvin Barkley. He was Harry Truman's vice president. And this is one of his famous quotes. The best audience is one that is intelligent, well-educated, and a little drunk. In 1952, with the presidential election coming up, Alvin Barkley came to Sheboygan, the county seat about 15 miles away, to give an endorsement speech for Adlai Stevenson. Dad wanted to hear what he had to say, so he took me along. I remember standing in the front row, this was outside, and catching spit on my shirt. That's how close I was. Well, there was a photographer on stage next to him, taking pictures of the crowd. And the last thing my dad wanted was to have his picture in the paper at a political rally for a Democrat. So he ducked behind the person next to me as the photographer clicked away. But there I was, still in the front row. And sure enough, the next day there I was on the front page of the Sheboygan Press with a big smile on my face. Took a while for my dad to get over that, but he kept his job, and he ended up voting for, guess who? Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican. I like Ike. Even I got on the bandwagon. I gathered up some friends. I was 11 years old then. And we went around town ringing doorbells for Eisenhower. We called ourselves Tykes for Ike. Thanks to us, Ike carried Hingham, Hingham carried Wisconsin, and Ike won the election. I mentioned that Hingham was where I started my journalism career. Does anybody remember this machine? It's an Anderson automatic letter copier, the forerunner of the mimeograph machine. This one dates back to the 1920s it looks like. But it operated on the same principle. You type your your copy on a stencil, wrap the stencil around the cylinder, swab the inside of the cylinder with ink. The ink would bleed through the stencil and you'd crank out the printed sheets. State of the art. That's how my dad printed the church bulletins. My job was to fold them. And this machine is what gave me the idea to start a newspaper. I called it the Hingham Gazette. I borrowed the church's mimeograph machine to print the newspaper. It was more like a newsletter, 8.5 by 12, or 8.5 by 11. I charged 5 cents for it, came out once a week, contained mostly town gossip, but since I did all the work myself, the reporting, the printing, home delivery, everything, the Hingham Gazette lasted about 4 weeks. And that was long before the internet. On to Holland, Michigan. We're into the late 50s now, the summer before my senior year in high school. I attended a journalism workshop at the University of Michigan. You can see the date, August 14, 1958. This was for high school kids who were about to become the editors of their local newspapers. This clipping is from the Holland City News. Anybody remember the City News? It was a kind of a compendium of local news from the Sentinel that came out once a week. Anyway, that's me in the back. And Barb Walden, some of you will remember, was in the front, in the middle. And coincidentally, as Michelle mentioned, she's doing a program next Thursday, a Zoom program on Lavinia Pond. So this is another plug to watch Barb Walden next Thursday night. My classmate from high school and college, both. So it was at the beginning of my senior year, 1958, that I started at the Sentinel, and that's when I first met Randy Vanderwater. Here he is at his typewriter. As I mentioned, he was the sports editor then. From him, I learned the basics of journalism, the importance of fact-checking and spell-checking. We didn't have Google to do it for us then. How to write a lead, how to write simple, straightforward sentences. But the most important thing he taught me was to get somebody else to proof what you write. Randy, in a word, was my hero, my teacher. Someone I tried to emulate. Can't you tell? That's me about the same time. This is from my high school yearbook, the Boomerang, if any of you went to Holland High School. So I was Randy's acolyte. Here's a close-up. You can barely see it, but that's a press badge in my hat and a pencil in my ear, just like Randy wore them. What endeared me even more was that every once in a while a celebrity would come through town and he'd have me interview them. Here's one, Al Kaline. This was before the free agent clause that sent baseball salaries through the roof. Back then, players worked off season to make ends meet, even stars like Al Kaline. Well, he and a bunch of teammates would barnstorm around the state and play local basketball teams. Randy sent me to Zeeland High School to interview him after a game. This was the old high school on Main Street, and I showed Kaline this copy of Sports Illustrated with this picture on the cover. It had just come out, he hadn't seen it yet, and I wanted him to autograph it. Ironically, this isn't my copy. I found this on the internet, even though it has his autograph on it. Well, he asked me if he could see the article, and then he asked me if he could have the magazine. I said, sure. I mean, what would you have done? So I lost the magazine, and I didn't get his autograph, but I didn't get the interview. Here's another celebrity that came to town. Ronald Reagan, host of the General Electric Theater. Anybody remember him? The show aired on NBC back in the late 50s, early 60s. So why was he in town? It was to visit the GE plant on 16th Street as kind of a goodwill ambassador and to give a speech at the Chamber of Commerce. Randy assigned me to interview him at the One Friend where he was holding a news conference. So I crammed for the interview and read a short bio about him, not realizing that it was out of date. Then when the time came for the interview, I asked him how he and his wife, Jane Wyman, I asked him how they were able to manage their Hollywood acting careers and maintain a happy marriage. Well, it's like this, he said. Miss Wyman and I divorced some time ago. Then I'm happily remarried to a woman named Nancy Davis. And down I went to about 8 feet under the floor. But I have to say, Mr. Reagan handled it gracefully, which is probably why he went into politics later on. It also dawned on me later that by visiting all these GE plants around the country, he was laying the groundwork for something bigger, like running for president someday. So Al Kaline and Ronald Reagan were my first 2 celebrity interviews, thanks to Randy Vanderwater. Here's a picture I didn't intend to show. That's my Hope College roommate, Steve Morris, and me in a broadcast booth at County Stadium in Milwaukee. Steve found this one going through his stuff and sent this to me. I was still a Braves fan after living in Wisconsin, and we were going to make it big as sports broadcasters. We wormed our way into this booth to make an audition tape for WHTC. This was on an old reel-to-reel tape recorder. Then a rainstorm hit about halfway through the game, and everything got wet, and we lost the tape. That ended our sportscasting careers. Probably just as well. Steve went on to become a Presbyterian minister, and I didn't have the voice for it anyway. So, like Tolstoy, I resumed my quest for the green stick. The summer before my senior year, though, I went to Alaska at the invitation of another college friend, Jim Thomas, that sowed the seed for a piece I wrote many years later for the Chicago Tribune called The Ice Menace Cometh. It's in the book, and if we have time later, I'll read from it. So on to part 2, the green stick. As you can see, we moved around a lot, Detroit, Springfield, Chicago, etc. This covers most of the years I worked as a freelance. It was in Detroit that I met Marilee. I want to say a little more about the legend of the green stick. In Chronicles of Wasted Time, Malcolm Muggeridge talks about the emptiness Tolstoy felt in spite of his success with War and Peace. Here I was, a man in my 50s, he says. I was successful as a writer beyond my wildest dreams. I was famous. I was rich. I had every single gift that a human being could want. And yet I had to hide away a rope that was in my study for fear that I would hang myself. Tolstoy imagined that somewhere on his estate near Moscow, there was buried a green stick. And on that stick was carved the secret of everlasting happiness. And if he could find that stick, he would find the answer to the question, why am I here? Theologians ask that question all the time. I doubt that many journalists do. I doubt that Ernest Hemingway did, at least consciously. He was a journalist, started out as one anyway. I submit that in spite of himself, the why question, why am I here, is at the core of his work, just as it is for any creative person, any human being for that matter, who seeks to live a life beyond their basic physical survival. So why do I single out Hemingway? This book, Byline Ernest Hemingway, pardon me, need to take a drink of water, was put together by a former colleague of mine, Bill White. He chaired the journalism department at Wayne State University, where I taught as an adjunct. This book is a collection of Hemingway's articles and dispatches written over a 40-year period, mostly before he turned to writing fiction. I don't mean to compare myself to Hemingway, but this book was my inspiration for Dateline World. Mary and I were going through old books a few years ago to donate to a rummage sale, and I saw this book and thought, I could do something like this. So I ran the idea past my publisher, John Colby. He wasn't very keen on it, but he said, send me some chapters, which I did, and this is what eventually came out. Dateline World, 20 dispatches from the earth and one from hell. Like the Hemingway book, it covers a 40-year time span. These are stories I wrote mostly for the Chicago Tribune going back to the late 70s, when it was still a halfway decent newspaper, as my dad would say. The Tribune had a circulation of 2 million then and went all over the country. So what dispatch did I send from hell? You'll have to read it for yourself, but it's a parody of Dante's Divine Comedy. I call it Divining Dante. And it was inspired by the Michelangelo painting you see here of this poor lost soul descending into hell. I wrote it as an email exchange between Dante and Satan. It's the end of the 20th century, and Dante is updating his poem for a new edition. So he emails Satan in hell and wants him to recommend people from the 20th century to add to the Inferno section that has 9 circles of hell. I'll give you an example and you can read the rest yourself if you want. So we're down to circle 9, the bottom pit. This is what Satan tells Dante. Quote, 2 of my proteges, Hitler and Stalin, he says, are on Time magazine's shortlist for Person of the Century. I'm really the one whose picture should be on the cover, but nobody knows what I look like. Some artist from Florence, referring to Michelangelo, got the horns and tail idea from your poem, but the fact is, I change my appearance at will. Right now, I look like Osama bin Laden. I'm proud to say the Holland Sentinel was the first paper to run this piece. You see the date, December 17, 1899, Earth time. This was 2 years before 9/11, 2 years before the Trade Center attack, when nobody had even heard of bin Laden. And then the Tribune Media Services picked it up and it went national. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back 25 years to 1974. I just quit my job as a speechwriter at the American Hospital Association in Chicago, and we're moving to Charlottesville, Virginia. There are 4 in our family now, Marilee and me and our 2 boys, ages 5 and 3. So why Charlottesville? Do you recognize this place? Monticello. Thomas Jefferson's home. Marilee's mom, by the way, painted this picture of it. I just used the Michelangelo to build up to it. The reason we went there was to research a book I had set out to do on Jefferson. I was a big fan of Irving Stone, who wrote biographical novels. Remember The Agony, The Ecstasy, speaking of Michelangelo, or Lust for Life, about Vincent van Gogh, who was a preacher's kid too, by the way, Dutch Reformed. Anyway, with the country's bicentennial coming up, I figured the time was right to do a book on Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence. It was the last year of Watergate, 1974. The summer Nixon resigned. We didn't have a TV, so I stopped at an appliance store across the road from Jefferson's birthplace, a little town called Shanwell, just outside Charlottesville, to pick out a little black and white TV with rabbit ears, remember those things? So we could watch Nixon's resignation speech, August of '74. I always thought there was a little irony in that. I mean, buying a TV across from Jefferson's birthplace to watch Nixon resign. Anyway, by the end of the summer, things hadn't turned out quite the way I'd hoped. I had no publisher. We were running out of money. Marilee was pregnant again. And I needed a day job. So where did we go from Charlottesville, the home of Thomas Jefferson? Springfield, Illinois, the home of Abe Lincoln. There's a little irony in that, too. I got a PR job in a hospital there, but my heart wasn't in it. I just wanted to keep working on my book. But still, no publisher. The rejection slips kept piling up. Meanwhile, it's 1976 and another presidential election is coming up. Jerry Ford is running against Jimmy Carter. And I applied to be a speechwriter for President Ford. I'd heard that they needed some help during the campaign. Remember when he was our congressman, Michigan's 5th District? He'd come to town once a year or so and park his trailer in his mobile office in front of Mills Ice Cream Parlor on College Avenue. Anybody could come in off the street and talk to him, discuss whatever they had on their mind. It was very accessible that way. Even spoke at my dad's church a few times. So I felt some loyalty to the man and applied to be a speechwriter for his campaign. This was after he was nominated in August of '76. Here he is with Betty Ford. You see Bill Milliken, who was governor at the time, on the left-hand side. So it was in August of '76 that I got a call from the White House. Would I come for an interview? I had 2 days of interviews, actually. First day was with some lower-level White House staff in the old executive office building next to the White House. The second day was with the top brass, and that took place in the West Wing. which you see here with the Marine Guard at the entrance. And to say that I was intimidated by that would be an understatement. I have a few distinct memories of that day. I was waiting in the reception area when a middle-aged man, he appeared to be in his 60s, late to middle age, came in out of the rain. It was a dark, gloomy day in September, and he had on a black raincoat and a beleaguered look on his face. The receptionist picked up the phone and said, "Secretary Butts is here to see the president." Anybody remember Earl Butts, Secretary of Agriculture? Well, he was being called on the carpet by the president, I found this out later, for a racist remark he made on the plane flying back to Washington from the convention. And it was overheard by John Dean, of all people, Nixon's old White House lawyer. Remember him from Watergate? You see him on CNN now and then as a commentator. Well, John Dean was covering the convention for Rolling Stone magazine. He must have been hard up for work after serving jail time. And he reported what Earl Butts said in Rolling Stone, and the next day it was all over the news. And within the next week, Earl Butts was out of a job. So I caught a little glimpse of history. If I can get this to work. This is how the New York Daily News played it. It's a sad story, really, how Earl Butts met his demise. So who did I meet with in the West Wing? It was this guy, Robert Hartman. I Googled him and found his picture under the heading "Famous Pipe Smokers." He really wasn't that spooky. Hartman started out as Ford's chief of staff and later became counselor to the president. That's when I met him. And what I remember most vividly is his white loafers. You see them? He's with President Ford there. I don't know what they're doing. Anyway, they ushered me into his office, which is Hartman's office. And there he was with his feet propped up on his desk, wearing those white loafers. So all the time I sat there staring at his white loafers. Another thing, on the wall next to me, I was sitting on a sofa like a love seat in an alcove. And on the wall to my left, there was a picture of President Nixon and John Ehrlichman. Remember him? He was Nixon's domestic affairs advisor. I looked for the picture, the same picture, but couldn't find it. This was the closest I could find. If I recall, they both had smiles on their faces, but this was before Watergate. I asked Hartman, who was sitting there with his sneakers on his desk, why that picture was on the wall. He said, "Oh, this is Ehrlichman's old office. We've been so busy since we moved in, I haven't had time to change the pictures." Here's another picture of Hartman with President Ford, taken right after the Nixon pardon. Hartman was in the Oval Office with him when he announced it. So that's as close as I ever came to a seat of power. I didn't get the speechwriting job, but neither did Ford keep his job. About 2 weeks before the election, Mary took the phone call actually. White House called and said, "We're going to look at our staffing after the election, and then we'll be in touch." Well, Jimmy Carter won, and as they say, the rest is history. I wasn't destined, apparently, to be a sports broadcaster or a presidential speechwriter. So I went back to print journalism, which really had become my focus anyway, and I was getting pretty good at it. In 1979, we moved from Springfield to Chicago, and that's when I started writing for the Chicago Tribune. As I said, it had a circulation of 2 million then. I worked mainly with 2 editors there, Al Borkover in travel, and Tom Stites, the Temple editor. Some of you met Tom when he spoke at HASP last September. After my book publisher said, send me some chapters, I went through my files and picked out 20 stories from the 200 or so that I had written, and focused on those that I thought might have some time value. I ended up with 21. I'm going to show you a few of the tear sheets so you can see how they first appeared. Here's a piece I wrote on James Michener, the author. In the book, it appears under the heading King of the Blockbuster. You can see the creases in it. It was in my file for 30 years. Michener's first book, Tales of the South Pacific, won a Pulitzer Prize and was made into South Pacific musical. When I asked him what advice he had for young writers, he said, make sure Rodgers and Hammerstein read your first book. I would add to that, don't quit your day job. Anyway, live papers picked it up, which was a good thing because it was the last interview he gave. He died 2 months later. Here's another piece I wrote for Temple. Virginia Dare, pardon me. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in North America for her 400th birthday. In the book, the heading is America's First Missing Child. 400 years later, now going on 440 years, we still don't know what happened to her. The search for Noah's Ark. Was there really an ark as described in the book of Genesis? This one took me to a mountain called Amri Dagi in eastern Turkey, the biblical Mount Ararat. And I have to say, I came home a little less skeptical than I was before I left. Russia by river. A look at rural Russia before the Ukraine invasion. The vast and fragile army about China's famous terracotta warriors. The Emperor Qin had these made to protect him in the afterlife, and they were hidden for about 2,000 years. That's me in the middle picture with the farmer who discovered them. Here's a close-up. He discovered them when he was digging for a well on his farm. This was about 50 years ago. Now he makes his living signing books at a museum there. I think I paid $3 for his autograph. He said he makes more now than he ever did as a farmer. The Amazon. More than 4 million indigenous people once lived in the Amazon basin. Now the number is down to about 120,000 because of the vanishing rainforest. Our mistreatment of the planet and each other is a theme I treat in a number of these articles. It took a while, but something finally came of my Jefferson research. Here's a piece I wrote for the Chicago Tribune magazine about Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. It eventually found its way into this book. Miracle on Chestnut Street, that came out a few years ago. It wasn't a big blockbuster, but my publisher tells me it has some shelf life, and he plans to reissue it for the 250th anniversary. of the Declaration of Independence, our country's 250th anniversary, birthday. Bill Barker wrote the foreword, by the way. He played Jefferson in the Inventing America series that we filmed at Hope several years ago, no review over there. Here we are at a book signing we did together at Monticello. You see him there in costume. Bill not only portrays Jefferson, but probably knows more about him than anybody else. He's a scholar as well as an actor. And he had just written his own book about Jefferson called My Life as a Founding Father. Before we go to part 3, I want to mention one other piece I wrote for the Tribune and how I came to write it. The 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the Nazi death camp, is coming up. We were living in New Jersey then, and I'd read an article in our local paper about a woman named Tova Friedman who had survived Auschwitz as a child. Well, I called her up. I'd been thinking of doing a book about child survivors. This goes back to when I was a kid and sat on Corey Kinboom's lap. It's another story maybe I'll tell later. The Holocaust was a subject I knew nothing about and wanted to explore, so I called her up. She lived right across the river in Highland Park. Her daughter answered the phone, and I explained why I was calling, and she said, well, my mom talks to school kids now and then. She might be willing to talk to you. Let me have her call you back. A day or two later, Tova called me back. How could you possibly understand what I went through, she said. You're not a Jew, and Hitler's war was a war against the Jews. Please, can't we just sit down and chat? I said, I really would like to meet you. Well, come over then, which I did. She was very leery of the whole idea of telling her story, especially to a non-Jew. But she agreed on that first visit to tell me at least the beginning of her story, and then she would decide whether or not to tell me the rest. She began by talking about her early childhood in the ghetto and the Gestapo conducting roundups and sending her neighbors and grandparents off to who knew where, and then going to a forced labor camp with her parents. It was a 3-step process. First the ghetto, then the labor camp, then the concentration camp. And she told me about what she experienced at Auschwitz. She was 5 when she arrived, 6 when she was liberated. She described the Russian army approaching the camp. The Germans had already evacuated. And the Russians cutting the barbed wires and freeing the prisoners. She said, we were liberated on January 27, 1945. And then she said, what date is it today? I looked at my watch, and it said January 27. It's only 1994, so it was exactly 49 years to the day that she was liberated. I think that was a sign for her that it was okay to tell me her story. Then she said, would you celebrate with me and have some wine? Just then her husband, Mayor, I had not met him until that time, came into the room with a birthday card. Tova opened it, and it was from another child survivor, Frida Tenenbaum, and it said, happy birthday, Tova. Today we are 49 years old. The story you see here, Outliving Auschwitz, came out a year later of the 50th anniversary of their liberation. In Dateline World, it's called The Remembrance. Here's the book that eventually came out called Kinderlager, which means children's camp in German. Kinderlager was a section of Auschwitz where the children were held before they were sent to the gas chambers. The subtitle is An Oral History of Young Holocaust Survivors. It contains Tova's story and the stories of two other children, Frida, whom I mentioned, Frida Tannenbaum, and Rachel Hyams. It took only a year to write the book, but it took about 3 years to get it published. I don't know how many rejections I got. I stopped counting at 30. What kept me going was reading about Dr. Zeus, Theodore Geisel, who wrote under the pseudonym Dr. Zeus. And the first book he wrote, To Think I Saw It on Mulberry Street, he got 27 rejections on that. So I just kept at it. Meanwhile, we hit a few bumps. They say things happen in threes. In the span of 6 months, I lost my dad to a heart attack. I lost my job. Now I kind of know how Earl Butts felt, although the circumstances were different. And we lost our house in a fire. 3 things in that order. July 27. Life is what happens to you when you have other things planned. This little book of quotations was on our nightstand the night of the fire, July 27, 1995. You can still see the smudges. This is how the local paper covered it. We were back in Riverside, a suburb of Chicago. We had never sold our house when we were in New Jersey. So we had just moved back when the broke out. I won't go into details, except by the grace of God, we all survived, including a friend of our son who was staying with us. Eventually, he was burned quite badly, but eventually recovered. If things happen for a reason, I suppose this was it. And that brings us to part 3. You can go home again. We're back in Holland, where I spent my high school and college years. Back then, I couldn't wait to get out of town. It was too Dutch, too stodgy, too uptight. You couldn't do anything on Sunday, and I wondered what that had to do with being a Christian. Anyway, we're back. At least in my case. Mary is living here for the first time, and I couldn't be happier. By now, Kinderlager was published, finally, and it found its niche as a young adult book. The Scholastic Teen Book Club, here's their catalog, picked it as a must-read. You see it there on the upper right. Here's a close-up. Scholastic also is the Harry Potter publisher, but that book sold a few more copies than mine. They share the same publisher. So you see, I even have a higher billing than Emily Dickinson. The New York Library named it Best Book for Teens, and the Institute for European Studies in The Hague called it one of the top 10 books on the Holocaust. If I recall, the Diary of Anne Frank ranked first, and I was just below Schindler's List. Number 6, I think, on the list. I even got invited to the Hour of Power. Anybody remember that program? This was for a tribute they were giving Corey Timble. Remember I sat on her lap? Here I'm being interviewed by Robert A. Schuller, the son. He's a Hope grad, by the way. And so was his father, which may be why he got invited. Anyway, that was my 10 minutes of fame. 20 million viewers. Kinderlager screenwriter, eventually got turned into a documentary called Surviving Auschwitz, which won an Emmy Award, and an endorsement from Elie Wiesel. She's wearing on the front cover. So this is the companion book for the series. We're running short of time, so I'm going to wrap this up. Most of my work after moving back to Holland was for public television anyway, not for newspapers, so I'm going to kind of gloss over that. But I do want to say something about this film, Wilderness to World Class. It's the story of Holland, Michigan. Thanks to Howard Vinniclausen, who organized the Holland Film Group, it was the last opportunity I had to work with my old boss, Randy Vanderwater. And I'll always be grateful to Howard for that. Randy and I were voluntary consultants on the film. Ben Beversluis is here, he wrote the script. Randy passed away on June 22nd, 2018, a huge loss to all of us. He was 88. Laurie Timber wrote this wonderful tribute to him in the Sentinel. It was Randy at his typewriter. Laurie called me when she was writing this and asked if I had a recent picture of him. And I said, as a matter of fact, I do. And this is it. Marilyn took this picture of Randy and me, teacher and protege, on Memorial Day, the year before he died. So I end this talk where it began by paying tribute to Randy for the start he gave me at the Sentinel many years ago. Which brings me back to the green stick of the quest for everlasting happiness. Tolstoy never found it, and he was one of the world's great writers. I doubt that many of us will ever find it. If I ever find it, it won't be because of my writing, but because I'm right back here where I want to be in Holland, Michigan, with friends and family, and where people know my name. Remember the song from Cheers? And so, Mr. Wolf, Mr. Thomas Wolfe, I say you can go home again. Thank you, Randy, if you're watching. Thank you all for listening to my story. Before I wrap this up, we have some special guests I'd like to introduce. They are Randy's widow and her family, Mary Vanderwater. Would you stand up, please? Her daughter's here, Catherine Speeder from Grand Rapids. Her son, Ken Stam, and his wife, Mitzi, who live here in Holland. Could you stand up? Or at least give a wave. Mary contributed the artifacts from Randy's collection for the journalism exhibit. If you haven't seen it yet, I urge you to do so. It's in the room off to the left as you come in the front door. I forget the name of the room.
It's the Focus Gallery.
Focus Gallery. Brought back a lot of memories for me. So please, let's give Mary and her family another round of applause. There's someone else I want to introduce, but before I do that, I want to show you a clip from Inventing America, the show we filmed at home several years ago. John Tommy directed it, by the way. Where are you, John? Give away. There he is. Second to last one. This is from episode 3 about the Bill of Rights. In this clip, Fred Johnson, professor of history at Hope, who was the moderator, he asks Thomas Jefferson, played by Bill Barker, about the role newspapers play in a democracy like ours. Bear with me while I try to fish it out here.
I'd like to ask you, what is your take on the First Amendment, and how important is it to a democracy like ours?
I thank you, Dr. Johnson. I hope that I had emphasized how worthy our First Amendment is earlier, recognizing those inherent rights that are given to the family of man, not by any government, not by any ruler, those rights that are given to man by nature, nature's God, the first and foremost amongst them, to hold an opinion freely and to freely express one's opinion. And that, of course, allows for the freedom of the press. Now, that is not to say that all newspapers print the facts. No, I would agree they do not, because certain newspapers become known as tabloids. They are the ones you cannot depend upon. They are the ones who print what you call it fake news, twistifications of the facts, deceits and lies, and yet, citizens, you are free to peruse them as you choose. So I would be concerned, citizens, about preferring a tabloid over a newspaper that you can depend upon. And therefore, Dr. Johnson, as I have written and pronounced once more, we're left to me to decide whether we should have this nation with a government and no newspapers, or have this nation with newspapers and no government. I would not hesitate a moment but to accept the latter. Who must be informed? Who must make up their minds to what they read in the newspaper? What American citizen would ever seek to satisfy solely themselves by reading one newspaper that prints only what they want to read, without reading the opposite opinion, and then make up their mind for what is best for everyone? It is an ancient adage, citizens, wherever the press is free, the people will be free. Thank you.
Let's get rid of that one.
There you go. You got it.
So that takes us to the highlight of our evening, which is to honor Sarah Leach, the executive editor of the Holland Sentinel, for her coverage of Ottawa Impact and her subsequent nomination for the Pulitzer Prize in local reporting. I want to say a few words about the Pulitzer Prize and how Sarah came to be nominated. Excuse me. The Pulitzer is the highest award in print journalism. There are actually awards in 15 categories, as well as for fiction and nonfiction, playwriting, poetry, and music. So the awards cover quite a variety of genres. They're also the most sought after and competitive in the country. Last fall, Ben Beversluis, and I'll call him up in a minute. Last fall, Ben announced at a monthly HASS meeting our intention to nominate Sarah for a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on Ottawa Impact. I know a lot of you were there, and Ben's announcement drew quite an enthusiastic response. Tonight, I'm happy to announce that Sarah has in fact been nominated. It was a long, complicated process, and we want to honor her for that and for her reporting on Ottawa Impact, which I would describe in two words: courageous and comprehensive. Sarah's nomination was official as of last month. Well, Ben, if you could join me up here. There were three of us on the nominating committee, but Ben, careful of the wire here.
Yes. Yes.
Ben did the lion's share of the work. Ben was Sarah's predecessor at the Sentinel, and before that ran the Lakeshore Bureau and the Grand Rapids Press. 30 years in journalism, is that right? Something like that. The third member of the committee was Tom Stites. I mentioned it in my talk. He was the founder and is still the president of the Banyan Project, a nonprofit that seeds news co-ops, online news co-ops in towns that have lost their newspapers. He also was an editor at the New York Times and Chicago Tribune, one of my bosses at the Tribune, and he supervised a couple of Pulitzer Prize winning projects himself in that capacity. Fortunately, I was not part of either one of them. Tom couldn't be here tonight. He lives a few miles away in Newburyport, Massachusetts, but he wrote a letter to the Pulitzer Committee endorsing Sarah for the award in local reporting, and I'd like to have Ben read it.
Can you give me this?
Thank you, Milton. Yeah, this is a letter that Tom included in the nomination process, which included sorting through 180 some articles. We were only allowed to submit 7. That was a task in itself. It's probably harder to write all 187 though. And some endorsements and so on from some other journalists and so on. And this is a letter that Tom wrote on Milt's invitation to the Pulitzer Prize Committee. Last fall, I had the pleasure of participating in a panel discussion with Sarah Leach at Hope College in Ottawa County, Michigan. In the process, I learned about her coverage of Ottawa Impact, a far-right group that took control of the Ottawa County Board of Commissioners in January 2023. I marveled at her relentless comprehensiveness. When our panel ended, it was announced that Sarah was going to be nominated for the 2024 Pulitzer Prize in Local Reporting. The crowd of 300 erupted in a standing ovation. I confess to having been moved by her community's heartfelt appreciation for the exemplary service she was delivering, the deep civic need she was filling. Since then, I have followed Sarah's coverage of Ottawa Impact with keen interest. At a time when newspapers are in decline, her work demonstrates how important diligent reporting is to preserving democracy at the local level. Sarah illuminates the way you're supposed to do it. I heartily endorse her for this honor. Sincerely, Tom States, founder and president of the Banyan Project.
Thank you, Ben. Don't sit down yet. Before we call Sarah up here, I also have an email to read from Greg Jaffe of the Washington Post. He's one of the reporters the Post sent here to cover Ottawa Impact from a national perspective, and I'd like to read what he said. Bear with me for a minute. It's kind of type is rather small. Greg is another Pulitzer winner, by the way. This is what Greg writes. Sarah and the Sentinel have done such a phenomenal job all year of holding local government accountable. Without her reporting, I don't know what would have happened to the county's health department. The cuts likely would have been much deeper. I know national reporters from all over the country, the Washington Post, ABC News, Political, have noticed and admired her excellent work. County government is a basic building block of our democracy, and so is hard-nosed, smart, tireless local reporting of the sort that Sarah has done all year. Now, I can't think of a more fitting way to celebrate the history of journalism in Holland than to call Sarah up here so we can thank her for all she's done and to give her a really special award. We want to give Sarah this plaque. Ben, would you mind reading it?
Yeah, make me cry more.
We, the undersigned members of the Sarah Leach Fan Club and Pulitzer Prize nominating committee, certify that Sarah Leach has been nominated for the 2024 Pulitzer Prize in Local Reporting on the 25th day of January, 2024. Myself, Milt, and Tom have signed this.
So you hang this in your bathroom or
Okay. All right, I'm gonna try not to cry. I'm a little bit of a crier. Sure, thank you. Yes, it's quite heavy. So I had prepared remarks today. I think that that's going to change a little bit in light of your talk, Milt, because honestly, I related to a lot of the things that you just said. I think that you would be surprised that we have had a couple of cross sections in our personal histories where I also lived in Virginia for a little while. I also went to Monticello and was quite inspired. And my career actually was really deeply affected by 9/11. I was a senior in college at the time. I was the editor of the student newspaper at Central Michigan, Fair Up Chips. And the plan was to be a reporter. I loved reporting. It was my passion. It was what I wanted to do. But life is what happens when you're busy making plans, as you said. And that was not the path that life chose for me. I learned that day that I could lead a team and I could withstand a lot of pressure, that I could cope with a lot of dire circumstances and be able to find a way forward. As long as I knew how to go forward, I knew that I would be okay. That being said, the economy collapsed shortly after that because the world was a very tumultuous place, and so the only jobs that were in the business were editing. And so into editing I went because it was a way for me to be a part of newsrooms and part of the work that I loved. And I've been the majority of my career behind a desk for 20 years, and none of this was ever supposed to happen. I think sometimes life just puts us in positions where we have to do things that we didn't expect to do. That certainly was the case at the beginning of last year. We had one full-time reporter last year. But that wasn't enough. So I had to do what I had to do, and I had to step in and I had to help. And it was my full intention of giving that story back once everything calmed down. And I tried a couple of times, and it just never happened. And sometimes you don't even know that you're in something until you're in the middle of it. And that is exactly what happened. It's still going on today. I'm really tired. But
I'm raising 3 kids?
My 3 monsters that probably are not paying attention right now, but that's okay. Love you, Pi Pi. So I have 3 kids in the meantime, and honestly, you just go to work every day. And so I will continue to go to work until I'm no longer needed. I have every intention of going back into the shadows of editing. Once this is all over, I do not thrive in the sunlight. I burn quite easily in the sun. And I'm really trying to learn how to take a compliment because it is Milt's intention to make people see me, even though I fought him every step of the way. So I sincerely... But honestly, this is a once-in-a-lifetime moment. Some of the reticence that I have is because it's very bizarre to take pride in a situation like this, where none of us want to be here. None of us want to be experiencing this. None of us want to see this happening in our county, in our community. I want this to be over as much as everybody else does. So I'm going to try to just see this for what it is and say thank you for all of the praise and the support that we have gotten in local journalism. I never thought I would see something like this in my career. It's been overwhelming, and I will cherish this for the rest of my life. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I didn't realize this until earlier today when I was reading the paper. The Ottawa County Board actually is meeting tonight.
Right now.
Right now, as we speak. Sarah chose to be with us. I thought she just wanted to get away from it.
But
think she was working on her phone while she was listening.
I was.
Working.
I'm following the tweets from Mitch.
We are so proud of you, and what a treasure you are to our community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Pulitzer Prizes, by the way, will be announced on May 6th. So stay tuned. You'll have a chance in a few minutes to congratulate Sarah in person and to wish her well come March 6th.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you again, Mel, for being here this evening. Congratulations, Sarah. Thank you for being here this evening. Thank you to all of you for being here this evening. I do hope you will join us. There are some refreshments in the museum lobby. You can also check out the Newsflash exhibit if you haven't had a chance. Milton will be out there signing books. You can purchase books. If you have a question for him, I'm sure he'll be very happy to answer your question as well. But we're going to end things here now, as it is getting almost to 8:30. So thank you again for being here. We hope to see you again soon here at the Holland Museum. Thank you.